Well, good evening, Ron. How are you this evening?
I am very well, my friend. How are you?
Doing very, very well. Happy October.
Absolutely. You're looking very New Englandy tonight.
You know what? I'm a plaid whore. There's no getting around it. I love it. I'm a complete New England boy. LL Bean is my god. So
That's right. Yeah, this is our Western Pennsylvania kind of like it's chilly outside. This is what I'm going to wear.
yeah, it's darn cold here today. I actually did something that I didn't think I'd ever do this early. I turned on the heat. Turned it on really low, but I turned it on because oh boy, it was. I came down this morning. It was bone chilling.
Well, as the age sets in, I think that I've had my heat on since like the 1st of September. I like to have my house temperature right around the temperature where I can grow ficus trees year round.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. Every year that goes by, every new gray hair, and I get a little bit more susceptible to the cold. That Viking blood is only going to last me so long. So
So much longer. That's right. That's right. So we have a cool show tonight, don't we?
we do indeed. This is kind of, in a way, it's a kind of a spiritual successor to our Birth of Horror cinematic show that we did towards the end of the first, I guess technically we can call it the first season of Monday Night Monsters. But we're going to eventually do an official part two where we jump out of the 40s and into the 50s and 60s of the sort of origins of horror. But tonight we're going to focus on, of course, Halloween, because why wouldn't we?
I think as soon as pumpkin spice hits the coffee, it's time for one of these programs. I think it's just
Absolutely.
suitable for that time.
And I'm sure as all you folks out there know, we are big, big cinematic, or cinephiles here. We love monster movies. We love horror and spooky stuff. And so we always drop info on the movies when we talk about the big monsters out here. But sometimes it's fun just to focus on the movies themselves, because honestly, how many of us would still be in the monster industry if it wasn't for all these great movies?
Exactly, exactly. I can't wait to see if there's any overlap. To the last time we did was pretty close. We had some pretty cool overlap there. So
There's a little bit on this list. As I was putting the slides together for tonight's show, I noticed that we had a very little bit of overlap, but not in the same level. So we're gonna have a couple of revisits for movies, and of course, you get to tell your sort of perspective on them, and then I'll get to do mine, and we'll see
we
how we line up on that. So. Well, folks, let's see. It's a few minutes after 8 p.m. and tell you what, let's get us started. So Ron and I, of course, this evening are going to be counting down our top 10. And I'm going to tell you right off the bat, this is an arbitrary list. I mean, every year a new movie comes out, or a couple new movies come out, or my opinions change. And I don't know about you, Ron, but my favorite list will fluctuate from time to time. But this right now is a good current top 10 list for me.
well, I think even putting this together, I think in retrospect, like I probably could not give you a top 10 list simply because my mind doesn't work in those kind of categories. But let's put it this way: the movies that I gave you tonight would be the 10 movies that I would not mind watching at any time over the Halloween season.
It seems fair enough. So, well, let's get us started, and let's zoom into number 10 and see what we both chose here. So, at number 10 on our Halloween perfect movies to chill your soul list. All right. So, Ron, why don't you start us off?
Right. So whenever I gathered this list together, I made it so that every single one of my movies takes place in and around Halloween. So that I don't know if I might not have read the assignment correctly, but so I made it so all these have a Halloween setting to them. Okay. So the first one, you have to go with Halloween because it has become an iconic type of movie. Now, I will tell you, whenever I was growing up, my mother really didn't like us watching any kind of the slasher movies. Okay, and I never cared for them either. That's just not my taste. But Halloween was one of these unique movies wherein there was a lot of murder but very little blood. If you can remember, this wasn't like a gory type of movie. The writing wasn't all that great. A lot of the cinematography was a little off as well too, because I remember one of the famous scenes towards the very beginning of the movie. They're walking away from high school, which is supposed to be in Illinois, and behind one of the trees, there's a great California palm tree behind them. So a lot of these kind of things fell through. But I've been doing some research on this film for the last few years, just how it has shaped the Halloween that we know it. And there's a lot of sociologists out there that state that Halloween did not become one of those scary type of holidays until this movie came out. And I think there's a lot of credence in that. We don't see the murder aspect. We don't see the disembodied body parts throughout the yards until this movie becomes part of our consciousness, right? So it's done a lot for the way we think about Halloween. You've got that great tune at the beginning too, that very scary driving tune, which I do have to point out as well too. There's a crossover here, folks. So if anybody here likes Flashdance as much as I do, which I do, Flashdance, it was actually filmed in Pittsburgh. The Michael Cimbella Maniac that was actually based upon the opening of the Halloween theme.
That's pretty bizarre.
Yeah, and it was called Maniac because it was supposed to be about a serial killer, but they bought it instead for Flashdance, so he changed the words for it, but he kept that same tune. Isn't that awesome?
That is full on bizarre. I have to say that I'd never heard of that. So that's a nice little factoid to pull out of my next from my next party trick there.
So. Right. So it's called, the song is called Maniac, which, there you go. But he made it into a dancer instead of a serial killer, and it's based upon Carpenter's ding 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 sound.
And of course, that soundtrack is iconic. Carpenter, I think a lot of people don't realize that John Carpenter composed the music for that film and did that for quite a few of his films. His soundtrack to The Fog, which is another one of my absolute favorite John Carpenter films, is absolutely chilling as well. And he's not a particularly complicated composer, but he gets to the core of that chilling sort of minimalist, musical style, and it's incredibly effective. So I've always been a big fan.
And I'm glad you brought up about The Fog as well too, because it's a highly effective horror movie as well too. So So number 10, Halloween comes into my.
And I do want to chime in on that one because I didn't put Halloween on my list, and it's not because it's not a phenomenal film. It's one that I've loved for years and years and years, especially, of course, the original. The sequels a lot less so. The sequels and remakes not less so. I'm a huge fan of Halloween, but I'm not a huge fan of slashers either. And as a result, there were so many other movies to choose from for me that really kind of captured the Halloween spirit. I decided to leave it off the list, and I also had a suspicion that one of the two of us would end up picking it, so I knew it would make an appearance. And so I didn't feel too bad about it.
Well, to all the slasher fans out there, to all the slasher,
there's nothing wrong with slasher films if you enjoy them. It's just not really my cup of tea. And
mine either, man. Mine neither.
But one other thing is that that you were saying, you're joking, you didn't understand the assignment. To me, the idea of this list was movies that are Halloween themed or have a Halloween vibe to them. Don't necessarily have to specifically be Halloween or mention it. They just have to be something that captures that Halloween spirit. So, for instance, a movie that I love, I was kind of tempted to put on here, was Ghost Story, based on the Peter Straub novel, but it's set at winter time, and to me, it doesn't bring a Halloween vibe at all because it's all set in this snowy town. So, my sort of emotional clock doesn't trip, when I see that movie, even despite the fact that I love it. So all these should have at least a good autumnal vibe to them, I think. Which certainly I believe my choice for number 10 does, which is the Blair Witch Project. And this is a very polarizing film because, of course, there are some people who watch this movie who say, I can't stand it. A shaky cam makes me sick. It's a movie where absolutely nothing happens. Other people say it's the scariest movie I've ever seen. It's one of the most polarizing horror films ever made. And it's also considered to be, although, this is a little arbitrary as well, but it's considered to be the birth of the concept of the viral marketing campaign. Because when they started advertising this movie, they did it as if it was a real event, real found footage. They had missing persons websites for the three main characters of the film who disappear in the film. And, to me, that's phenomenal because it was something that was incredibly convincing. And a lot of people probably to this day still believe that it's actually based on a true story. And that's incredibly effective marketing. But one of the reasons that I love Blair Witch Project is because I'm a camper. I love to go camping. I love walking in the woods, and getting lost in the woods can be very unnerving and very terrifying. And I also like to think that if I was out in the woods with my friends, and one of them disappeared, that I've always believed I'm a fairly smart guy. I've always believed when I watch monster movies and killer movies that I'd survive because I'd be smart enough not to do the dumb things that these people do. But this movie manages to do something incredible, which is that it tugs on your sort of, your emotional strings, so that when the first character vanishes in this film, you see the panic of the other characters, and they're so terrified at the loss of their friend when they start to hear these disembodied voices in the woods and they think their friend is out there. They do exactly the wrong thing and go in search of him, which is what puts them in jeopardy as well. And I thought to myself, I'd do the same. I wouldn't be smart in this case. I'd walk right into the sort of jaws of this this unseen presence in the woods. And so to me, it was absolutely terrifying. And I think that it's one of the most effective found footage movies, if not the most effective ever made. And if you folks haven't seen it, I think that seems unlikely, but if you haven't seen it, it's, as I say, it's a very polarizing film. It may not strike a chord with you, but if it does, it can be truly terrifying. And I think that's amazing because it's a film, there are no special effects. You never see a monster. There's no high-tech film. It's all grainy footage, and yet they capture this emotional state that is so terrifying. And I think the last few seconds of that film are probably the most terrifying climax to a horror movie I've ever seen.
I agree. And these are all reasons, Chris, why I do not go camping. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I think it's appropriate that we started out with these kind of bookmarks. You got the iconic slasher movie over here. And as you said, the very first found footage movie that really took off. And I will tell you, I don't mind the sequels to Blair Witch either. They're nowhere near as great, because it's typical Hollywood at this point. But I think they do a good job within that Blair Witch universe.
I thought the second one, Book of Shadows, was pretty difficult to watch because the first one was so unique and so iconic. And I thought the second one kind of dropped the ball on that, although they were smart that they didn't want to make the same movie again. And they tried to do something very different. I wish it had worked for me. It really didn't. And I have to confess, as terrible as it is, because I've heard it's okay, is I haven't seen the one that they just called Blair Witch, which was kind of sort of a semi-remake / reboot as far as I understand.
Yeah, it's the brother looking for the Heather Donahue character.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's a kind of like, retreads that ground. Yeah. So,
but interestingly enough, before we get off of this right here, I was at a pizza shop about 2 years after this film was released, and there was actually people arguing at a table what happened to these kids. So I'm sure there are people out there nowadays that think this is truly an actual case.
And that right there, again, that is the mark of some brilliant filmmaking. Absolutely. If you have people convinced that your film is real, then you've certainly done something right. They hit a target that very few filmmakers make. So whatever else you may think about that film, certainly it's incredibly effective. All right, so let's see. Let's move on to position 9. So in 9th place.
All right. I forgot about Pumpkinhead.
Trick or Treat and Pumpkinhead. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll lead us off on this one and tell you that Pumpkinhead, I'm not surprised that you forgot about Pumpkinhead. I almost forgot about it when I was making this list. It's in a way, I think it's kind of an obscure film. It's also a movie that has several sequels that did not in any way live up to the quality of the original, but that's directed by Stan Winston, one of the greatest practical special effects and creature designers in the industry. He's created some of the most iconic characters and creatures in monster film history, and this was his first directing effort, and it's surprisingly an incredibly effective little film. It's a very low budget film, but it's got a great looking monster, and it's also, what I love about this film is I love folk horror and I love harvest horror. Harvest horror, of course, being set around autumn time and dealing with things like harvest rituals and folk magic and things like that, and that's very much what this film is. It's about an Appalachian community with people who are essentially poor farmers. And they run afoul, some out-of-towners run afoul of the locals, and a witch calling herself Old Haggis, which is, what a great name. A witch calling herself Old Haggis ends up explaining to one of the locals what he can do to get revenge on these out-of-towners for what they've done. And don't want to give anything else away, except that it's a movie that it can be violent. It's a little bit on the gory side sometimes, and that's going to be a present in a lot of these films, but it's such an effective little folk tale. And I think it's even got a great heart to it. It's got some amazing, of course, makeup special effects by Stan Winston. And it tells such a, again, very classic folksy story. To me, that's the sign of a movie that I love. And it takes place certainly not specifically at Halloween time, but there's a whole thing about a pumpkin patch that essentially is the origin of this mysterious demonic creature that gets summoned and then goes on a rampage. So if you don't mind a little gore, you love great practical special effects and a really classic sort of folk tale, I think Pumpkinhead is a perfect Halloween film.
Also starring Lance Henriksen, who I really, really like as an actor. So
He is. He's a fantastic character actor. I think he's got one of the most distinctive looks and faces. He's got that gravelly voice, and he really sells this film beautifully.
he does. He does. So mine, number nine, again, misreading the assignment, a Trick or Treat, which is set, surprisingly enough, on Halloween. And we have this little demonic trick or treater boy that leads us through an anthology of various Halloween themed scary stories. But truly, the reason why I chose this as my number nine, and I'm hoping that she's watching, but Anna Paquin stars in this. And not only does she star in this show, she also plays a vampire, which is my favorite horror character. So, Anna, if you are indeed watching Monday Night Monsters, there ain't no ring on this finger, is what I'm saying. So, again, I cannot say it enough that, again, this is a simple little story. It kind of reminiscent of Twilight Zone, but nowhere near as well crafted. But we go through kind of these kind of, ironic stories where what you think is going to happen does indeed happen. But it's a fun Halloween movie. It does have some gore in it, but again, it's a cool Halloween romp.
It really is, and it's a film that we're going to get to again a little bit later in the list, and I'll share why I like the film as much so well. But I highly approve of your choice. Where it will, as I say, I'll give you my full thoughts on it a little bit later when we get into it. So let's take a look at our tiers number 7 and see where we are.
Yeah, see, Van Helsing, okay, so I will be totally honest with you. And Anna, if you are indeed watching, I apologize for this. So not the runner-up, but I think my first choice would be
Kate Beckinsale's got to be.
exactly. I'm thinking that she might be slightly out of my league. See, she's British and everything like that. So I'm thinking that maybe Anna, but no, look, whenever she's on the screen, she is very beguiling, isn't she? Like she takes, I really like watching her. And I thought Van Helsing was a good show. I'm not going to cover it. You are, but I chose Lady in White. I don't know if you've ever seen this, Christopher.
I have indeed. I love it.
Yeah, it is. It's atmospheric. It's well written. It's well acted. A very young Lucas Haas, right around the time of his Witness. Whenever he did the movie Witness.
I think that's how he got his job, actually.
I think so. It's just a really well done movie that takes place on Halloween. Involves a ghost. It involves sins of the past. Just a really, really well done movie, and it's one of my favorites.
It's a fantastic little film, and what's interesting about it is that it's a deceptive film in a lot of ways too, because as you're watching The Lady in White, it sometimes feels like a kids movie. There are times that there's a cuteness to it, there's a goofiness to some of the scenes. The Lucas Haas is a fantastic young actor. That scene where he's reading his own monster story to the kids in class is not only adorable but very goofy, and you are very taken off guard by this film because it has such a cute, homey style to it. And when it suddenly turns a corner and becomes incredibly dark and disturbing, it really strikes you. I mean, it's a movie again that has a wonderful, a wonderful style, great atmospherics, very Halloweeny, but also very homey and wonderful. So that really makes the dark elements much more disturbing. And there are some very disturbing moments in the film. So I consider it to be a real Halloween classic. Now, I chose Van Helsing mostly because Van Helsing is here's another very polarizing film. Some people absolutely despise this movie because it's certainly not horror on any level. Van Helsing is an adventure movie. It's directed by Stephen Sommers, the same man who brought us The Mummy back in the early 2000s. And this movie it's goofy. It's silly. It's an adventure story. It's like somebody took the old Universal monster mashup movies like House of Frankenstein and that got together with Indiana Jones and they had a baby. So it's got like James Bond style gadgets and bizarre adventures and everybody's super campy. But it's also a movie that features Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman. There's even a cameo by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it's just good, ridiculous, over-the-top fun. And to me, Halloween is hugely about fun. And I think one of the things that makes the Halloween season so much fun is that there's always a sense of lightheartedness in Halloween that, like we were talking about a few moments ago, that kind of undercuts the horror, but it makes the horror stuff all the more interesting. So Van Helsing, you've got you got flying vampires, and you have, lightning bolts, and the creation of the Frankenstein monster. The opening scenes in black and white are absolutely brilliant. They feel just like a recreation of the old Universal horror films, which was exactly what this was, a licensed sort of reboot of the Universal franchise. And then you've got Hugh Jackman as this sort of, Indiana Jones style version of Van Helsing, and Kate Beckinsale as the Gypsy Queen with the sword, and it's good fun. It's full of monsters, and to me, I try to watch these Halloween movies like I'm a 12-year-old. I mean, in my head, I think I'm emotionally as mature as a 12-year-old, so it works out great. And I love to watch these movies the way I think I would have seen them as a kid. And when I was 12, if that movie had been on screen, I would have been in love with it. So I still love it for that reason to this day. So it's always struck out as one of the great Halloween movies for me, even if it really isn't horror on any level.
Yeah, that's a great popcorn movie. You will come back from the movies with your hands covered in butter, and you will not be dissatisfied one bit because you would have had fun.
Agreed 100%. So let's see where we are with tier number. Actually, that was tier 8, and I thought that we were on tier 7. So sorry, my math skills have never been very good. So let's see where we are, however, with tier 7. Oh, look at that. We have come back to Trick or Treat.
Wow. So, yes, we have. And my Monster Squad is kind of like a kid's version of Van Helsing in a way, because we have the mashup. We have the Dracula. We have the Frankenstein monster. We have the mummy. We even have an appearance of the Gill Man from the Creature from the Black Lagoon. Right. So this is like, your typical, I believe this was late 80s fare. Oh, yeah, it was. 87.
It was 1987.
Right. So if you can imagine Pretty in Pink and all these other kind of movies, this has that same type of feel, right? The kids are bratty, they're smart mouth, they're smarter than the parents, and they are living in this great little world. Whenever I was a kid, I would want to live in, and that's the reason why it's number 7 on my list.
Well, once again, you've hit on a film that I'm going to address a little bit later on, and I'll give you my full thoughts on it when we get to it later in the list. But I agree with you 100% on that one, which is why it's our second overlap of the night. As for me, Trick or Treat being our first overlap of the night, again, a huge favorite of mine. I love the fact that it's an anthology film, so you've got all these little bite-sized stories in it. I love the fact that it's a fairly violent film. It's definitely not a kid's film, but once again, it has a really strong comedy undercurrent, and they use that comedy to undercut the horror. It has amazing Halloween visuals. It's a movie that is so dripping, as you can see, in this image with the house just literally festooned with pumpkins. It's got Halloween oozes from every pore of this film, and that alone almost makes it worthwhile. Even if you didn't like the movie, you could put it on in the background of a Halloween party and always have something really fun and really sort of autumnal and Halloweeny on the screen. And to me, it just screams that. It can be a little violent for my day-to-day taste. Again, I say that I'm not a huge fan of slasher films, and there's a little element of that in this, but even so, it's always done with a sense of irony, a sense of goofiness, and to me, it's a hit, straight out of the gate.
Yeah, Christopher, I'm glad that you said that, because a lot of the movies that I will have, especially towards my number 1 choice, does have an ambience to it. So these might not be great movies, but the ambience is so Halloween, it just appeals to me so much. So
I'm all about that. Sometimes a movie is eye candy. Sometimes a movie, may not be a particularly brilliant movie. I'll bring up a movie that's not on this list because it really is just a low budget, sort of piece of throwaway film. But have you ever seen or heard of a film called The Devonsville Terror?
Yes, I have, as a matter of fact. Yes.
This is a movie that I've loved for years and years and years because of its ambiance alone. It's an incredibly low-budget film with almost no one you've ever heard of, although somehow they managed to get Donald Pleasance, the very, very well-known character actor, to play an important role in the film. But other than that, no actors you've ever heard of in here. And it's a story basically set in a Salem-like town called Devonsville, where they had killed 3 witches at some point hundreds of years in the past, and then a new girl shows up in town and immediately starts to sort of trip the same triggers with the local male population. They find her attractive, they find her threatening, and all these other things, and so they start to believe, because they're still carrying the weight of their own ancestors, they start to believe that she's a reincarnation of the witch they killed 300 years ago. And it's it's badly written. It's a terribly paced film. It's a snooze fest in some ways, but it also is really shot in one of the most gorgeous autumns I've ever seen. Every scene has trees that are just ablaze with color, and it feels so much like autumn that to me, I could just put it on silent and enjoy the ambiance alone. So
Great.
yeah, I'm fully
Another
with
movie
you.
that does that for me, and it's not on my list, of course, is the Dead Poet Society, which
Of
has
course.
beautiful cinematography.
Yeah, and again, you know what? And I love that. I love the fact that sometimes a movie is just like a walk in the woods that you can put
Right.
on screen. Not that the Dead Poet Society isn't worth a lot more than that. It's a
Yeah.
phenomenal film, but sometimes you just need that sort of cozy atmosphere, and that's something that I really love about this season. And I like cozy horror movies, as strange that may seem, but there are some great cozy horror movies out there, and I always try to have a couple of them on my list.
Sweet.
So let's see where we are at number 6 now. All right. Well, I'm going to start you off, Ron.
Oh,
Or
so
Charlie.
I've got 5 kids, so inevitably there is going to be programs on here that are kid related because I've seen them 1,000 times. So R.L. Stein had this great thing with Nickelodeon where they were putting out some pretty good quality movies, and I'm talking about genuinely scary movies. And this one right here is Cabinet of Souls, which I really found very, very effective. It reminded me a lot of Something Wicked This Way Comes.
That was the first
It
thing
was,
I
it was
thought when I saw the trailer for it.
Absolutely. It was well acted. It was well written, and it just was an effective horror movie. And if you are, this is something you could watch with a child, but just a really, really cool movie that reeks of the Halloween that I remember whenever I was 14 years old.
So I can't really add anything because I haven't seen it. But when when you had put it on your list and I was looking for some info on it so I could add it here, I did watch the trailer for it. And again, I was immediately struck by the similarity to one of my favorite stories of all time and a movie that could easily have made this list. I ended up leaving it off for other reasons, but which is Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, which again has the sort of dark carnival vibe. And that's a funny little Halloween trope that I have always had a huge fascination for, is the dark carnival idea. When I grew up, there were still carnivals that would come to town, whether it was like the traveling one that has the Ferris wheels and all the food courts, or the ones that actually were like a real circus and everything. And there is always something just a little bit eerie and a little bit off about that foreign sort of little village that pops up in the middle of your town with all these strange people in strange outfits and then just disappears after a few days. It's almost mystical in and of itself. And so I've always found the dark carnival idea very intriguing and very creepy. And so that's why Something Wicked This Way Comes, why I think I would probably really enjoy Cabinet of Souls. And I'm actually going to have to download that and check it out as well.
Yes, you shall.
Yeah, definitely something I would like.
And I would like to see these kind of fall festivals resurrected, because I've not seen one for a number of years, and I would love to see it happen again. And another one of my movies that's not on this list, but still a good movie, is Curious George's Halloween. And the whole gist of this movie is that they are surrounding a fall festival, which is, again, if you have children and you want to waste 60 minutes of your life, Curious George's Haunted Halloween.
I just actually spent the weekend at a fall festival called the Norman Bird Sanctuary Harvest Fair in my hometown of Newport, just about an hour's drive from where I am, and absolutely adored it. But that's one that, in a way, was very formative for me. I've been going to that same harvest fair since I was a kid, and they have an apple press and making fresh cider and the tents and everything like that. And so that just the smell of hay is so autumnal to me, and again gives you that like cozy, spooky feeling, which I love so much.
Now, thinking that you're up in the New England area, did you have any good old-fashioned witch burnings up there during that?
Interestingly enough, Rhode Island, where I grew up, is the only one of the original 13 colonies that never executed a witch.
Very impressive. Very impressive.
Yeah, I like to say that we waited till after they were dead and we dug them up and accused them of being vampires, but at least we waited till they were dead. So
excellent.
Speaking of some folk horror, one of my absolute favorite book series when I was younger, and I'm sure some of you have read them at some point, is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was a series of 3 books by a guy named Alvin Schwartz, and it has the distinction of kind of, I would say, getting away with murder, because the illustrations in these books were genuinely chilling, like dark, very, very frightening sort of watercolor illustrations, and they showed monsters and skeletons and corpses corpses and things like that. But these books were aimed at younger readers in a time when I would say I feel like we were a little bit less sort of protective of our kids and maybe let them make their own choices, which I don't think is such a bad thing. So I grew up reading these stories that could be a little on the gruesome side, almost all based on folk tales. And a few years ago, very, very well respected director Guillermo del Toro announced that he was going to write and produce an adaptation of that for the screen. And that came out in 2019, and it was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And he did something which I think was maybe smart, which is instead of turning it into an anthology film and just trying to retell a handful of the stories from the books, because as I say, they're just a collection of short stories, some of them only a few pages long, he decided to turn it into a narrative and came up with this idea that a woman who lived in this 19th century mill town was wrongly accused of essentially trying to kill the children of the town, and ends up being put in an asylum and dies under terrible circumstances. And her ghost now haunts the town, but her ghost has a book that is full of these scary stories, and that if anyone ever asks her to tell them a story, they get written into the story and inevitably die. And it's kind of a goofy premise, but it's used beautifully in this film. And these four kids who are the main characters accidentally, of course not believing the story, accidentally invoke the spirit of Sarah Bellows, read her book, and end up now fighting for their lives. But it's great because much like the original Scary Stories books, it doesn't really pull its punches. I mean, it's not a gory film, but it's very creepy, and it's got genuine peril. Kids get consumed by these monstrous creatures, and it always has a real sense of peril. And so therefore, I think it feels a lot like the Scary Stories books. They did an amazing job, again, using practical special effects to recreate the creatures that you used to get to see in the illustrations of these books. And this film is dripping again with Halloween atmosphere, whether it's the beautiful foliage, pumpkins on every doorstep, and it's set on and around Halloween. And so to me, it's one of the finest new Halloween films that's come out in years. And also, bizarrely on the family-friendly side. It's a PG-13 film. It doesn't have any excessive gore, not more than a few drops of blood. So, it's got a little bit of an emotional terror level, but it doesn't have anything really garish in it. So, depending on how mature your kids are, it's not a bad watch for them.
And I've not seen it yet, so it's definitely going to go on my watch
I would highly recommend it.
Yeah,
highly recommend it. I mean, maybe not perfect, but certainly one of the best films of its kind in quite a few years, I'd say.
Great.
All right. So on to our second half here. So we have at level number 5.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You got to talk about Ginger Snaps, which is a film I love.
Yes. And Fright Night is one of the films that I love too, but I could not remember it being set during Halloween. And again, missing this assignment. But I chose Ginger Snaps because there is a Halloween scene in there. Because this takes place over the fall when there are somebody dressed up. I believe it's his Little Red Riding Hood, if I'm not mistaken. It's some sort of ironic turn of the tables. But who cannot like this movie, right? Low budget movie, 2 great actresses together, good visuals, good practical visual effects, right? There's no CGI in this. It's very story driven. And I just cannot say enough about Ginger Snaps. It's just one of my favorite series.
It's a phenomenal film, and actually there are 3 films in the series. And unlike what normally happens with with low budget or independent films and things like that, where the sequels are just lower and lower in quality, the sequels actually get better, which is amazing. The original film is incredibly low budget. The creature, while made with practical effects, it's a good effect for practical film, but I didn't love the werewolf design. They improved it in the second film, and then they went right over the top in the third film, and the stories get more interesting as they go. Plus the original film especially, and the sequels to some degree, really smart, really witty, got some really cutting sort of ideas and some really interesting social angles. I mean, the first film deals a great deal with sort of female empowerment, and the werewolf, sorry if this is a little bit of a sensitive topic to talk to, but it ends up being attracted to Ginger, the victim who becomes the werewolf later, by her menstrual blood, and that idea runs through the entire film and actually makes it for a really creative, really unique film and a series that I absolutely adore.
A great coming of age movie with a werewolf in
it. Exactly, which to me is every coming of age movie is ultimately a werewolf story, especially when your kids get to be teenagers.
That's right.
So Fright Night, of course, is a huge, huge film for me. This came out, I think, 1985. And in 1985, finding a good vampire movie was tough enough, but this film ended up becoming a hugely iconic movie because Fright Night is a modern, gory, and fairly mature vampire movie, but that harkens back to the movies of old. In fact, they do it very intentionally. They show a whole lot of clips in the film from older vampire movies like the Hammer horror films of the 1950s and 1960s, which I absolutely loved. They have phenomenal veteran actor Roddy McDowall playing Peter Vincent, who is a retired kind of washed up actor who used to be in those old films, and he is sort of shanghaied into becoming a real vampire hunter by the kids who are the main characters of this film. And it's the vampire next door trope done beautifully, in a way, in an era when slasher films were really getting huge, and they even make a joke about that in this film. This was a throwback to classic horror. Has a great deal of fun humor in it, but some real peril, some real horror, some phenomenal special effects, and again stands very high on my list of fantastic horror films of the 80s. And being a kid of the 80s, of course, I'm always going to believe that the 80s had the best horror films of all time. And I'm sure 90s kids feel the same way. But of all those great films that came out throughout the 80s, I think that Fright Night stands almost head and shoulders above them.
Yeah, a kid of the 80s as well, too. You can't go wrong. Roddy McDowall. And another great piece of social commentary as well, too. So Roddy McDowall represents the old ways, right? And whenever the kids find him, he's already getting evicted from his apartment. You know, the old ways are being torn down for the newer ways. So that's a great kind of analogy about what's going on. That's great kind of commentary. But whenever they redid Fright Night, they used, it was David Tennant, right, that they used as that character.
Yep, David Tennant and Colin Farrell.
Yeah, and it was well done. It was a great sequel, but nowhere near the same spirit that this movie has.
No, it didn't have the soul of the original. It didn't have the humor, and it didn't have it didn't have that like fun throwback feel to it. So while I enjoyed it as a sort of it was in a way, it was kind of a slasher movie with a vampire in it. So while I agree with you, it was well done and is an entertaining watch. I watch it and it's kind of hard for me not to think, wow, they just missed the mark on that one, because there was so much charm in the original. And yes, by the way, John, Fright Night has amazing music by Brad Fiedel, I believe, was the composer of that, and it is just this great kind of super synthesized 80s music that is bizarre but incredibly fun. And I think every time I hear a strain from that soundtrack today, I just want to immediately put on the film. So,
absolutely. And speaking of Fright Night, the vampire in Fright Night was Chris Sarandon, who also played the love interest in Flashdance.
Oh, in Flash, you know what? I had no recollection of that. I haven't seen Flashdance in 25, maybe 30 years at this point, so that's not surprising. But that's great. So just a stupid bit of humor here, but Chris Sarandon, obviously plays the vampire in that, and another very famous actress, Susan Sarandon, in Rocky Horror Picture Show and everything. But for as long as I've lived, I have called her Susan Sarandon and him Chris Sarandon, and of course it's the same last name. I believe that they're either related, they're closely related, maybe brother and sister. I'm not sure, but it's the same name, should be pronounced the same way. But I refuse to change the way I pronounce it.
Me too.
So it's always going to be Chris Sarandon and Susan Sarandon, or the other way around. I'm not sure. So let's see where we are at number 4 here. So number 4, we have, all right, Silver Bullet and the Haunting.
Yes. So Silver Bullet, again, it starts to take place. The beginning of the movie takes place at the end of summer, but it comes to the climactic scene at Halloween, because I was sticking to the script. So Silver Bullet with a scene-stealing Gary Busey, with a very young Corey Haim, based upon a novella by Stephen King, which actually was one of the first illustrated type of books out there, which I found fascinating. Effective special effects in it. Well written, and look, I just can't say enough about this movie, because back in '85, this was like this was my kind of coming of age. I was getting into my middle teens at this point, and this is one of the movies I could go see at the movie theater by myself. So it was just one of those things where I remember this movie very fondly for those reasons. And the sister to Corey Haim is Megan Follows, who played Anne of Green Gables on the PBS version of that.
She's
And
a
she's a Canadian
fantastic
actress.
actress.
Yep, she's a great actress, and I actually got to see her play in person Juliet in a version of Romeo and Juliet up in Stratford, up in Canada, whenever I was
Oh,
in
that's
college.
fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it has a great cast. It really does. It has, again, you've got a young Corey Haim, who was a really fantastic young actor in such a
it
tragic
was.
life, but such a fantastic young actor. You can really see it in there. He really sells the film. Megan Follows is just wonderful. It has that Stephen King sort of, again, that like folksy hominess to it. I wouldn't say I feel like it's a great film, but it's a warm film. Again, it's in a
Right.
weird way, despite the fact that it actually is pretty violent. It has that cozy family sense that Stephen King is so good at doing, and I love it. And I had read Cycle of the Werewolf, the novella that he had done before that, and it's an interesting story how that even came to be. Cycle of the Werewolf was originally pitched as a calendar, and I believe it was going to be published by, it was Ballantine or one of these companies, and they said, let's do a calendar, and every month of the year, we're going to have an illustration by Bernie Wrightson, a fantastic illustrator and horror artist, and a little vignette, just one little sort of paragraph vignette by Stephen King. And over the course of 12 months, we'll tell a story. And they were like, yeah, sure, that sounds like a fun idea. So they started into it. And as they went into it, Stephen King just wrote more and more and more. And eventually the pieces that he was writing for these months just couldn't fit on a page anymore. And in the meantime, Ballantine, I think it was Ballantine, but it might not have been, but the publisher said, you know what, we don't really want this project anymore anyway. We're going to pass on it. And so it ended up evolving into the novella Cycle of the Werewolf. Still has all the amazing illustrations by Bernie Wrightson, still has Stephen King's wonderful prose, but that's why it's broken up into these little month segments, and basically goes from I don't know, I think it takes place starting in February or March. Actually, it starts in January and then goes right through to October. And so it's such a fascinating little booklet. It's a quick read, but I think it's great fun, and I have always very much enjoyed, especially that unhinged performance by Gary Busey, who wasn't quite as crazy at that point as he became later in life, but still a little bit on the bonkers side. So let's see. So my choice for number 4 is a film that I have loved for many, many years, The Haunting, which is, of course, based on Shirley Jackson's, I think, 1960s novel, The Haunting of Hill House, 1960s or maybe late 1950s. And this is a story that is, it's a phenomenal example of how horror can be done brilliantly without gore, without special effects or anything else. There's none of that in this film. It doesn't have blood. It doesn't have any overt violence, and there's no special effects whatsoever. It uses sound, inference, and just some phenomenal performances to create this haunted house, and tells a haunted house story that's honestly convincing. I mean, it is such a terrifying story, and it's been remade a few times. I can't say enough about how bad the late 1990s remake The Haunting was, with some fantastic actors. It had Liam Neeson, it had Lily Taylor, Owen Wilson, and a bunch of other great actors in it, but just was a complete flop, chock full of special effects, and couldn't scare the wings off a fly, unfortunately. But the original 1963 Haunting, I think that was Robert Wise maybe directed that, just an absolutely chilling and wonderfully effective psychological horror film. And I think, again, not specifically set on Halloween, but has that autumnal chilly vibe. Haunted house movies to me are always perfect for Halloween, no matter what time of the year they're set in. So that was my pick, certainly, for this tier.
And it's my opinion that all the horror movies, all the haunted house movies after this, really pays homage to this. Even The Conjuring, I'm a big fan of The Conjuring, but that movie even owes a lot to just the way The Haunting was set up.
And everything from the strange camera angles, from the way that the camera follows sounds, which is an interesting conceit. In fact, Sam Raimi, who of course ended up going on to create the Evil Dead movies, uses that trick in his films, where the sound on the screen is this terrifying sound, but the camera follows the sound, and even though you're not seeing anything, it ends up becoming very terrifying, as if you're watching something invisible. And an amazingly effective psychological tactic that has never been done better. So Sarah, you're very right. Cheap jump scares are way overutilized. I don't even mind a few jump scares in a movie, but being able to build real tension in a film is an art form that unfortunately is not as common as it once was. Certainly, is certainly very underutilized, unfortunately. So where are we? Let's see. Tier number 3. Two movies I love.
Yes, yes, yes. So there's a meme going around right now saying it's that time of year where we all get together and pretend Hocus Pocus is a good movie. Now, I think that Hocus Pocus is a fun movie. It's entertaining. It was indeed filmed in Salem, which you can't say about a lot of movies, you know. So it has a very New Englandy feel to it. This is the kind of Halloween party I would like to be involved with. So watching this whole thing with the black hats and the witches and everything, I love this movie ever since it first came out. Now I will tell you, I recently watched the sequel that just came out a few days ago, and I thought that it was effective. I thought that it was fun. It made me smile. I don't think it was anywhere near as good as the original. But then again, I don't think the original was fantastic. It's a good movie, but it gives you that Halloween feeling, and that's why I chose it.
I actually have a sort of perspective on Hocus Pocus, which is that Hocus Pocus is not a good movie, but it is a great movie, which is a very strange thing to say. But because Hocus Pocus, from a filmmaking standpoint, feels very, very amateurish. It all looks like it's set on sound stages, like it was something that was filmed in the '60s, like Bedknobs and Broomsticks. The acting is hokey. It's incredibly campy. A lot of the jokes fall flat. So is it a good movie? Probably from any kind of filmmaking standpoint, absolutely not. Is it a great movie, however? Hell yes, it is, because this is a movie that has struck a chord with so many people. Again, a movie that is just literally dripping with Halloween atmosphere, whether it's, cobwebs, witches on broomsticks, black cats, cemeteries, pumpkins everywhere. So it absolutely strikes that Halloween vibe. They did film it in locations all throughout, like the Salem and Danvers area. So you've got a lot of authentic architecture and things like that. And it does its job. It's not only really Halloweeny, but it's got this wonderfully warm spirit to it. The main characters, the heroes there, Max and his younger sister Danny, have this wonderful familial relationship, which feels very genuine. You got the brother who hates his little sister, but also loves her, would do anything to protect her. Yeah. And it's just effective, and it's so much fun. And Bette Midler, Sarah Jessica Parker, and Kathy Najimy in the role of the three witches are so delightfully daft and goofy that you know what? I feel like if you can't sit down and enjoy that movie, you've lost the child in you.
Because there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, it's just delightful and dumb, but dumb in a lovely way. And so I'm a huge fan and always have been. And I'm also completely in agreement with you about Hocus Pocus 2. It's fun, it's cute, but it doesn't quite have the magic of the original. Some of it, when like the three witches are back on screen, sometimes they really capture that magic again. And it does feel like they never left those roles, which I think is a very great thing, considering that was 30 years ago.
That's right.
To still be able to inhabit those roles. The lead, the two actresses who are kind of the leads in them are actually really quite good. It's just the writing isn't quite on point. The movie gets a lot of brownie points from me because most of it was filmed here in Rhode Island. In fact, the majority of those central scenes are filmed right in downtown Newport. I got to watch them building the Sanderson sisters' house, which becomes the magic shop and everything, and walk by that every day. And I get a lot of kick out of that. So I give the movie some extra brownie points for that. But I don't think I'll rewatch it every year the way I tend to do with Hocus Pocus.
I agree. And you brought up the idea of the dynamic between the brother and the sister. And I think that really is what makes a good horror movie as well, because you see that also in Silver Bullet and a lot of these other films as well, too. Whenever you can really get right down to the heart of humanity, then you can be afraid, right? Then you can be afraid, and you can live vicariously through these people, because it gives you an incentive to watch it, and it gives you an incentive to want to pull for these guys to get through. And I think that's a great commentary on why we like these particular movies.
Great. And Sarah, a little kind of comment. I don't know if you caught that, but actually there was a really quick cameo for Gary and Penny Marshall in the film, because there's a scene which kind of breaks the fourth wall a bit, but there's a scene where one of the witches is peering through the windows while they're looking for their prey. They're the mayor, and they see a gay couple, interestingly enough, it appears to be, watching Hocus Pocus, but only a scene that shows Gary Marshall and Penny Marshall. So it's kind of a cute little callback. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but the movie's not about making sense. I thought it was a sweet callback since both of them have passed away since then. So,
Yes.
so my choice for this was, of course, the classic Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which we did mention earlier on. We both talked about the fact that comedy and horror make sometimes a great combination, and this is a film that I think is underappreciated by people who are fans of the original Universal monsters. This is, of course, produced by Universal Studios. It has original Universal Studios actors, including Bela Lugosi's only his second and last actual performance as Dracula. He only performed as Dracula twice during his career, at least film-wise. Once was in the original Dracula in 1931, and then he came again to play Dracula in 1948 for this film. Some people accuse this movie of, sending the monsters out on a down note because they're just the straight men for this comedy duo. I disagree wholeheartedly. You have the monster story that takes place during this film being played straight. You've got Dracula trying to resurrect the Frankenstein monster to be his immortal servant. You've got the Wolfman trying to stop them, and the original actors. You got Bela Lugosi, you've got Lon Chaney Jr. as Lawrence Talbot, the Wolfman, and Glenn Strange, a phenomenally gifted physical actor playing the Frankenstein monster for his third go around at that point, and he is a great presence in the film. Abbott and Costello, Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, do a great job just being their same goofy comedic selves, but the film is sometimes even on the spooky side. And as a kid, I loved the fact that I could laugh and be creeped out at the same time. That iconic scene in the basement when Bud actually goes into the room with the Frankenstein monster and sits on him by accident, not even realizing he was there. It scared the tar out of me because I thought Frankenstein was terrifying. So to me, that is in almost every ways the perfect Halloween film. You'd think it would be at number one for me, and it plays pretty close to that. But it is it's just such a great trick or treat, and that's exactly what this movie is. So to me, I will always adore this film and consider it one of the great classics of Halloween. And if kids today don't get the humor of it, I feel like they're just missing out on something, and that's certainly a possibility. But for me, it will always be. I'm going to say something really dumb here, but this is kind of a way my brain goes. It's one of what I call my coffin movies. Like an Egyptian, whenever I go, I want to have a few very special things with me that go with me. And I think Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, I should have a DVD of that in my coffin, so in the afterlife I can continue watching it. So it is one of my coffin films.
Very nice. And I still, whenever Abbott is the very beginning doing that, whenever he's still gets me to this day.
It is, and to me, it's dopey vaudevillian humor, but it works for me, and it always will. So, all right, so we are getting down to the nitty gritty here. We're at number 2. So at number 2, we have Girl versus Monster, and again the Monster Squad back again.
Wow, 2 kids movies as well too. Isn't that interesting?
Indeed. Somehow they know Halloween.
They do. And I rewatched Girl versus Monsters the other day, and it really does not hold up from the first time I watched it. So I'm kind of disappointed I put it up at number 2, but it is a kid version of basically Ghostbusters. It's effective. The monsters are, appropriately scary, but it just drips Halloween. Every frame is covered in either a witch or a skeleton or a decoration or a pumpkin, and that's what I really like out of these movies.
You know what? I respect that entirely. And as we've said a couple of times during the course of the show tonight, sometimes it's just the atmospherics that work. I'm not familiar with the movie, so I can't comment on it. I don't have kids, so I don't get to see as many of these Disney Channel films as I suspect you are subjected to. But the truth is that I would probably enjoy it if it is that full of that kind of energy, because that is exactly what I love. And it's what makes Monster Squad, I think, such a fantastic choice for me too. I know that you love it, and I absolutely love it as well. And I love the fact about Monster Squad that it is, interestingly enough, you were saying it was like a kid's version of Van Helsing. And while in a way that's true, I almost kind of invert my perspective on it, because where Van Helsing is a surprisingly low-key film, the monsters never feel terribly threatening. They're much more actiony and much more goofy, and there's no gore whatsoever in Van Helsing. It's a mostly bloodless film. But what Monster Squad does, I think, brilliantly, is that it catches you off guard. You think you're watching a kid's movie, but these monsters are genuinely threatening. They kill people in the film. At one point, Dracula holds a little girl up and says, give me the amulet, you bitch. And you realize you're not really watching a kid's movie. You're watching an adult horror movie that uses the kid's trope to really sort of set an interesting tone. And the concept behind this film that absolutely, I think, is phenomenal phenomenal is they pitched it to Universal. Universal, of course, who own the Universal monsters, Frankenstein, Dracula, the way we sort of iconically remember them. They pitched it as, let's do a Little Rascals meet the Monsters movie, and Universal wouldn't go for it. But Shane Black, the writer, who by the way wrote Die Hard as well, remarkably, the same guy who wrote Die Hard wrote this movie, and the director Fred Decker said, you know what, this is too good of an idea. We're going to do it anyway. So they got the funding. It was a comparatively low budget film. They recreated these sort of slightly tweaked versions of the classic Universal monsters, but still very recognizable. Again, yes, you've got Dracula, you have the Gill Man, the sort of creature from the Black Lagoon. You've got a mummy, you've got a wolf man, you have the Frankenstein monster. And they said, what if a whole bunch of, sort of smart ass little, kids with a club devoted to monsters were the only people who believed in these monsters and could defeat them. And so the monsters are portrayed in such a goofy Halloween special kind of way. You don't expect them to be threatening. And when the limbs start to fly and blood starts to go, and like when Dracula, he takes a stick of dynamite and destroys the kid's treehouse thinking that they're in it. When you see these things happen, you're like, wow, this isn't a kid's movie after all. And to me, again, so close to being my perfect Halloween movie. And if I had put it at number one, I wouldn't have felt bad about it.
No, I wouldn't have been disappointed if I would have put it at number one either. And I will tell you this, and you guys can discuss this amongst yourselves. This is my opinion. Without this movie, we would not have Stranger Things.
I think you're probably right. Stranger Things recaptures that sort of Steven Spielberg classic 80s monster movie energy. And this movie almost has that Steven Spielberg sort of feel to it. And we're going to have a little Spielberg cameo coming up in just a moment, because I think we've got enough time to squeeze in number one.
All right. Well, I will tell you, if Sleepy Hollow had trick-or-treaters in it, that would be my number one. The Johnny Depp version is by far visually one of the most beautiful movies that I've ever seen. But the reason why I put E.T. as number one is because this was my summer for 1 year. All that great special effects that were in there. But E.T. proves himself to be this alien, this kind of miracle worker during the Halloween period, right? They fly across the moon. He and Elliot fly across the moon during Halloween. But one of the reasons why I put this up here, and I wanted to link this all together, is because I am a firm believer that E.T. the extraterrestrial was indeed a Jedi. Now let me try to work this out. So in the prequels, we do see the E.T. the race of the E.T.s, whatever they happen to be, at the Imperial Council, right? So we do know that in the Star Wars universe, the E.T. creatures exist there, okay? And then it's not until The Force Awakens that we see that Rey has a part of the Force that she can use to heal people, which we had never seen before. Well, we did see it before in E.T. whenever he used that Force to heal Elliot. Not only did he heal Elliot, but he also recognized the Yoda character whenever they were trick-or-treating. So it's very possible that within this timeline that E.T. himself was trained by Grogu, from the Mandalorian, and through some sort of rip in time and space fabric, that years ago thing, once upon a time, he kind of crossed over into our world. So that's my 2 cents. That's the reason why it's number one, simply because that is like my childhood come to life again.
You've got the fan theory thing down to a science on that one. But no, I always picked up on the very funny bit at Halloween where E.T. is in the ghost costume, being taken trick-or-treating by the other kids, and sort of, stumbles back when he sees that Yoda is walking towards him, of course, another kid in a costume. But it's a great moment. And actually, it is fun the way it sort of ties all that in. So I think that Spielberg and Lucas had a nice little sort of go-around going in sort of bringing those characters into the same universe, which is great fun.
And also the idea, like you said, that family dynamic, right? The mom's going through a divorce or just recently divorced. The kids were trying to find their place. It was that pecking order between 3 siblings. It was just a great movie from a story point of view as well, too.
And again, another phenomenal cast, and still just an outstanding classic to this day. Yes. And the birth in many ways of of Reese's Pieces, the fact that Reese's Pieces were not nearly, they were fairly newly introduced at that time, but because Reese's Pieces have such an important moment in that film, they became massively popular. It looks like we lost you for just a second.
Yeah.
The ghost is responsible clearly for that one. So, well, and my final movie, and we're going to run a couple minutes over, folks, but hopefully you'll stick with us. So, the final movie, of course, on my list. How could I not do Sleepy Hollow? Sleepy Hollow, to me, exactly what you said, Ron. It is such a visually gorgeous movie. Tim Burton is an interesting director. He's a little hit or miss, although I'm a huge fan. He's got an amazing aesthetic. He has a great way to tell a story, and this is something that I had wanted my entire life. I had wanted somebody to do a version of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow where the Headless Horseman is a real presence in the film, because the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is a story that is mostly about Ichabod Crane and his day-to-day life in the town of Sleepy Hollow, and the Headless Horseman is mentioned here or there as a kind of a ghost story and shows up sort of for a brief moment at the end, but it's not really a huge presence in the story, and the story also leaves you not even sure if the Headless Horseman is real or if it's all a big hoax. I've always loved the Headless Horseman character. I'd love to do, I think we're going to be doing a program on that hopefully before the month is out, because of course it's a huge part of my sort of folk roundtable here. But this is a movie that did exactly what I wanted. It was like, what if the Headless Horseman was real and really out there taking people's heads? And what if we did it in the style of the classic 1970s gory, bright red blood Hammer horror? And that's exactly what he accomplished. Tim Burton made this wonderful, gothic, lush, very autumnal horror movie with pumpkins everywhere and falling leaves and a Headless Horseman riding through these foggy woods. And it's just glorious. Is it even vaguely faithful to the Washington Irving story? Hell no. The Washington Irving story is barely to be found in here, but it's got the characters, it's got the spirit of Halloween all over it, and I can watch this movie time and time again. It's been out for it's been out for a little over 20 years now, which is amazing to think. Came out in 1999. Actually very, very fortunate in 2019, which was the 200th anniversary of the writing of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I got to be in Sleepy Hollow and see the film again on the big screen, and it was everything I remembered about it. Just sheerly glorious. And of course, you've got a great performance as Johnny with Johnny Depp as Ichabod Crane, this bizarre sort of socially awkward, bumbling detective who's a coward. The bit where he stands up on the bed and refuses to kill the spider and wants the little kid to kill the spider because he won't get down from the chair. It's so full of brilliant characters and brilliant scenes, and it's got the Halloween spirit just oozing out of its pores. So to me, it will, at least until something else comes along and knocks it off its pedestal, remain the greatest Halloween film ever made. Ron, we lost your mic there, it looks like. Let's see if we can get you back. Well, just in case, folks, just in case we don't get Ron's mic back, Ron, chime in if you can bring that back up again. But just in case, ladies and gentlemen, again, I want to thank you for sticking around with us and listening to us ramble on about some of our favorite horror films of all time. And of course, if you did have fun with us tonight, we'd love to have you back. If you're enjoying our Monsters show, hit that like button, comment, drop a comment with us on YouTube, subscribe. Those things help us a lot. They're going to help bring in viewers. That's going to help keep us going so that we can continue to bring some of this fun content to you. And next week's Monday Night Monsters, we're going to continue with our October Halloween adventure, and we are going to be delving into something that is a topic I am very excited about it, and I think, Ron, you are too, which is we're going to be talking about the origins of Halloween. All Hallows Eve, Samhain, the great pagan festival of the harvest, and I could not be more excited for that. So folks, want to thank you as always for joining us. Please come back and visit us next week, and we will see you again next Monday night on Monday Night Monsters.